The topic of this panel is very interesting. We're going to talk about different clusters around the country and how we can work together and how we're going to work together moving forward to really cultivate and nurture best ideas from all over the world. You know, you've heard a lot about the Massachusetts Biotech Cluster and how we're doing great in R&D, and we have world-class academic medical centers and academic institutions, and that's true. But there's smart people all over the world doing amazing things. And if there's ways that we can work together to help create access to different aspects of our ecosystem that you may not have as much of, we can do better. And we've been doing some of that. I'm Bob Coughlin. I'm CEO of MassBio. Many of you folks are familiar with the Massachusetts ecosystem. I want to introduce some of my colleagues here. We have Kristen is from Indiana, Kyle's from Kentucky, and Gavin is actually from Scotland. And we've been doing some work together, and we want to share that story and talk about how we're going to work more closely together moving forward. So I'll moderate the discussion, but it's a loose discussion. And you want to go next, or do you want me to pass it off to Kristen?
Well, I thought a perfect intro is the quote from you and in our conversations that innovation doesn't know geography. Cures don't know borders. And how is it that we best enable innovation to spread, given that we've got this diversity in terms of geographies as well as in terms of the kinds of things that we have going on the ground. So I figured that was a good starting point for this.
Okay, well, give us a little overview of what the landscape looks like in Kentucky.
On a positive side, you know, Kentucky is an incredibly diverse landscape. That's another way of saying that there isn't a real critical mass in any particular area. So looking at the kind of support we need in Kentucky, there's a little bit of everything. You know, there's a little bit of ag, there's a little bit of medical devices, there's a little bit of oncology. And all of it is worth paying attention to on some level or another. But when you don't have that critical mass, it's hard to get the attention of the VC. It's hard to get the attention of the big partnering opportunities. I mean, this is the definition of what it means to have flyover territory. Because unless, you know, I look at this back wall here, right? Mine doesn't look like this. And when you've got a few centers in the world that have this, obviously it's a magnet that attracts all sorts of people to come, whether to come and stay, whether to come and develop things, or whether to come and engage in partnering opportunities. Our concern starting the Turnpike was, how is it that we best support and enable all the little ponds that exist across the middle 2/3 of the country, as well as the places outside the centers of excellence.
Could you explain what the Turnpike is, just so people understand?
So the Turnpike actually started in a bar in San Francisco. And it was a conversation that Bob and I had about, he looked at me and said, what do you need on the ground in Kentucky? How can we do a better job of supporting the innovation that you all have? I said, well, Bob, I need a road to Boston. Yeah, I need a shortcut to get to Boston. And in typical Bob fashion, he's like, well, consider it done. We'll just build a turnpike. And it probably was.
As vodka sodas.
Vodka sodas. But the metaphor is apt in that that's what we need. We need to be able to start enabling these real virtual shortcuts that enable folks who otherwise don't have the map to figure out how to get from their land-grant university or how to get from their local community to get to the opportunities that are in Cambridge, that are in London, that are in San Diego. So that was the impetus of it. And the challenge has been since then, all right, so what does that look like in reality? How do you create, as much as I don't care for the term, it is an apropos term here, which is how do you create a virtual biocluster? How is it that you are able to shine light on innovation regardless of the boundary, regardless of the geography? How is it that you find good stuff outside of where so much attention gets placed?
Okay, let's hear a little bit more. Gavin, let's hear about your cluster in Scotland and then on to Kristen in Indiana.
Okay, well, I actually heard about this initiative just about 10 months ago in a conversation with Kyle in Boston, as it happens. There's a Boston theme going on here. And when I started to talk to Kyle about the situation in Scotland, I realized there was an uncanny parallel with what he was seeing. We actually live outside what we would call in the UK the Golden Triangle, and the Golden Triangle in the UK is Cambridge, Oxford and London. That is actually a different country. It's actually 450 miles of where we even are. Now, if I take the usual rule of a VC not being happy to fly more than an hour distance from where he's based, that actually puts us really at the extreme range of anyone who's down south looking at us. So we have a very similar situation. I mean, the expression I like to use is in space, no one can hear you scream. We have real difficulties in attracting VCs from either the other side of the North Sea in Europe and similarly in the US, although that is slowly changing. Equally, we have a very, very heterogeneous population of life science companies. In the Golden Triangle, there's a lot of drug, there's a lot of biologics, what I call wet pharma biotech. In Scotland, there's a lot of CROs, CMOs, some very punch-above-weight universities, relatively few what we call traditional drug companies, big digital health. The one thing that we do have, which I don't think I see at all in the US, is that we are heavily engaged with our main customer. As you appreciate, this is a government healthcare funded system we live in. And so we are working in the main extremely closely with the NHS, the National Health Service. And even compared to south of the border, we actually have one single database of 5.5 million people. And they all have the same records, the same format of records. One of my colleagues proudly said we have a lot of disease in Scotland. That makes it a great place to do research. I'm not quite sure that's a great way to put it, but it is a fact. Indeed. And in fact, with regard to working with US partners, we are, at the moment, part of the European Union, although just carefully watch that space. And we can effectively help companies in your space get into Europe at a relatively lower cost base than you would see, for example, Cambridge, Oxford, London, with the database we've got as well. So digital health is also a part of that. I hear a lot about digital health at Bio. So really some uncanny similarities with Kentucky, and that's where Kyle and I got to talking and thinking, well, we're across the ocean from each other, but that doesn't actually matter. The geography is irrelevant here. We have the same issues. There are probably some instant matches, and there's certainly people who need to get to know each other who don't know each other at the moment.
How about you, Kristen?
Thank you. So Indiana is somewhere in the middle in this group. I think we share a lot of the same geographic issues and challenges of getting the stuff we have in front of the people who are able to do something with it to progress it. You think of Indiana, you think a lot of a manufacturing state. Well, life sciences is actually the driver in our state. $67 billion a year in our economic product is coming from the life science industry. We directly employ 58,000 people in something like that. We have 3 large research universities, Notre Dame, Purdue, and Indiana University, that are clustered in some ways around cancer, neuroscience, and quite a bit around metabolic disease these days. We're also home to the orthopedics industry. So we have a very large, very diverse cluster. Much like what Kyle was saying, though, it's finding those pockets of innovation and developing them far enough along that it's of interest to somebody, to see them progress, to see them grow, and to keep them going. We have over 100 startups in Indiana, all of which are kind of just stringing it along. You know, they're getting grants, they're getting a little bit of interest here and there, but they really, really, really have to work it. And it takes them so much longer. It is so much harder for them to keep a company going and to get it off the ground. But where we have opportunities to tie in with the people who have the infrastructure already in place. And we have copied many of MassBio's programs simply because they are the best in class, they are world class, and they work, and we know they're going to work. So where we can apply those kinds of models and bring them back and use them, that has helped us develop our folks to a point where we can start to plug and play some of these people into this model. And I'm so excited to be here today and to be able to be a piece of this discussion, because I think we're on to something that's really, really cool.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all of you for being here. And you know, Carla, you made a point, and on the last panel we talked about, you know, some patient advocacy stuff. When you think about the fact that, you know, for me personally, I have a son with cystic fibrosis. I do not care if the cure for cystic fibrosis comes from Kentucky, Indiana, Scotland, Massachusetts, or Argentina, right? So that's where we're not competing. We need to take best ideas and find what it is that they need to turn into a company that can turn into a drug that turns into something that gets put into a patient, okay? When we were bouncing these ideas around, and we had an innovation summit out in Kentucky where they had the opportunity, it started 2 years ago, when we actually visited the University of Kentucky and some other academic institutions, and we were like, wow, this is amazing what's going on out here. Right? There's great ideas. How do we get the VCs that are extremely active in Massachusetts? How do we get the BD groups, the corporate strategics? How do we get the big pharma BD folks to look at this? Well, they're coming to MassBio. We have a thing called Pharma Days. And Pharma Days is when we introduce all of our small companies and any new technologies to the BD, business development groups from big pharma companies so they can do deals. We're helping them raise money. Why can't you take great ideas from Notre Dame? Why can't you take great ideas from the University of Kentucky? Why can't you take great ideas from Scotland and make those introductions? Maybe you have to make them in Massachusetts, but at least something will happen there. So this is real simple. So that Turnpike is really just a connection to something, an infrastructure that we have in place so that you can bring good ideas to it. And then it goes another way. You know, do you want to talk about?
Well, you know, the other piece of that is that there's a shared philosophy here, which is that at its foundation, this is patient-driven. That this isn't an economic development, right? We haven't talked economic development at all in this conversation. And I think that that's the secret to the partnership as we've developed it, is that as much as we all think about in some of our hats about driving jobs and creating all of this, the point of the Turnpike partnership is that it's about the cure. It's about staying focused on the patient and the patient's needs, irregardless, and that's what we mean when we say cures know no boundaries, that cures don't understand geography. So if you take your mandate that the patient is first in this equation, how then do you set up programs that actually support that? And it's interesting, when we took the economics off the table, then it changed the whole tenor and tone about how it is that we built the program itself. Because now, all of a sudden, the innovation takes center stage, and the location of the innovation fades to the rear.
Can I ask you a difficult question, maybe a little provocative? If you look at this Massachusetts pavilion, you have Mass It's All Here, Mass Econ, Mass Development, Massachusetts Life Sciences Center, the City of Boston Economic Development Group, Marlboro. We have all these economic development groups that are trying to create jobs in Massachusetts. Why should we be doing this? Why, like,
why should you be doing it, or why should I be doing it?
Well, I think I want you to dive a little bit deeper on the patient-driven aspect of it.
No, it's fair.
How is it good for Massachusetts if we're helping other states and other countries fund ideas?
Well, let me answer it from where I sit in Kentucky because it's the same challenge, except it's the opposite side. So when we first started this partnership, I'm sitting in the state capitol, and we get about halfway through this pitch, and the government folk that are sitting there say, "Whoa, whoa, 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 stop me here. Let me get this straight. So what you're doing is you're taking the best ideas from Kentucky, and you're buying them plane tickets and taking them to Boston. Are you out of your skull?" It only makes sense when you take the economics off the table, which is that from the perspective of innovation, where is it that our focus lies? Because if what I'm trying to do is find the cure, then I'm doing everything I can to help the startup and to provide the entrepreneur and provide the researcher with the resources they need. Now, if I have those resources in Kentucky, I'm happy to do that. But a lot of times I don't have those resources in my backyard. And I don't care where it is I find them.
Hey, Gavin, how about you? What do government officials in Scotland think about you wanting to come to different parts of the U.S. to create companies?
Actually, they're quite content about that. They recognise, you understand that I don't want to be a nationalist here, but Scotland invented the television, the antibiotic, the antiseptic, Termacadam. We're not very good at actually doing the next bit, whether that traditionally involved the financing piece or the exploitation piece, the commercialization piece. That is improving, but it's recognised that for the next bit, you absolutely need to get people who are doing this all the time and are successfully doing it. So reaching out to Europe, to that side, to the US, to that side, and further beyond, China now is a big player. They're very engaged, and they absolutely see the need to extend beyond our borders.
Thank you. Kristen, Indiana, that's the home of Lilly. Pretty big company. Why would these relationships, how do these relationships help your organization when you have a big anchor like that? Why do you need it?
Well, Lily's doing fine. They're everywhere. They're in your backyard. They're probably in your backyard. They're everywhere. They're a big global client. Indiana is a great place to build a company. We have a lot of the service providers. We have a lot of the contract research, contract manufacturing groups. So we are, if you can find a company that's already up and running, it's probably going to be cheaper to leave them in Indiana than to move them someplace else. They're probably going to be well established from that and served from that perspective. So I'm really not as concerned about that piece of it as it is getting it along faster. Our challenge is just speed in this case. It's a shame to have a cure or a therapy languishing in somebody's lab or sitting on a tech transfer office's shelf for years because they just can't make the right connection to the right person in industry who knows what to do with it next. And that's our biggest challenge. And if that means getting it out, heck, if we can out-license everything that IU and Purdue produce, fabulous, because that gets them out there and recognized as the research hubs that they are and should be. So that's good brand recognition for Indiana right there. The more we can do it, it really is the patient-driven aspect, and that is the key to the philosophy behind the whole thing. Get it there faster, get it off the shelf, and get it to the people who know what to do with it.
That's a great point. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how we can help get funding for great ideas through this collaboration, through this partnership, through this Turnpike, whatever you want to call it. What else can we do? How else can we help each other? Are there ways we can help with advisory boards? Is there ways we can help with board of director members? Can we use it to improve the image of the industry from a policy, an advocacy standpoint? Can we help share best practices in our state houses and in our governments?
Me?
You go.
I think it certainly on the policy side, but before we get to the policy side, I always have this, there's the punchline to Kyle's bad joke is that the three things we need in Kentucky are we need a chiropractor, we need a banker, and we need Magellan. And all three of those things we don't have in our backyard. And all three of those things are enabled by the partnership, which is that almost all of our young companies need a chiropractor because their boards are awful. You know, they need realigned because, and it goes back to the capital issue of, you know, when you're sitting in the Midwest, you're not necessarily accessing the most sophisticated capital markets. So you take any nickel you can get, which means that then those people end up on your board. Those people aren't necessarily the right strategically to get you from an A round to a B round to a C round. So we need the chiropractor, and we don't have good chiropractors there. We need the banker because we don't have the sophisticated, we don't have the mature capital markets in our backyards that we need to be able to get this stuff out. And thirdly, we need Magellan because, you know, different than Kristen, we don't have a big anchor tenant in Kentucky, which means that we don't have a whole lot of experience from the been there, done that perspective. So when we do have young researchers and we do have young companies that are coming out, they don't know where it is to turn to find the strategic partnerships. And even if we buy them plane tickets and we take them to Boston, they don't know which doors to open. And even if they found the right door by chance, they don't have the muscle to open the door, to get the meeting, to get it done. So through the partnership, and this gets to Bob's earlier question, which I somewhat evaded, which is what's the motivation for folks in Massachusetts to pay attention to what's going on in Kentucky? And the answer lies in that because the resources are there. And I think that when we have such concentration of resources, our vision tends to get myopic in some respect. And we're all better served by the diversity that we see when we're bringing in that fresh talent, when we're bringing in those fresh innovations, when we're bringing in the different perspectives.
And just to tag onto that and go back to the mentorship piece. So we implemented and I won't say stole, but we liberally borrowed from Massachusetts when we put together our mentorship program last year, and we have been very successful in getting people interested, getting people engaged in that process. So we now have a platform in place where we can identify startups, where we can identify the people who want to be engaged in a leadership role in the community. Okay, so the next step is then how do we connect those people with those people and those people and those people doing the similar kinds of things in those markets, and add that next layer that we really need, that access to the talent pool. And that talent pool runs every way. There are smart people in all of our areas who need to be better networked, who need to have those kind of relationships, and who can build upon each other's skills and expertise that way. So I think that's probably one of the better, easier examples of the way we've started working about this and thinking about it. I think there are a lot of other programs that we can look at to just keep building on that piece too.
I'd like to pick up on the point you just made there. I think it's a great one about you dealing with me, dealing with Bob, because I think where the pharma industry is now is where the IT industry was quite some decades ago, when you had Honeywell, you had IBM, you had big players. And then you had this explosion of small players in Silicon Valley, around the place, Seattle, and all the rest of it. These were all people who wouldn't wear shoes. There's some very interesting books at the moment about some of the people that did that. But I think that's where we are now, because if you look at where the innovation is coming from and what that cycle went through, we're actually there now. Now, these guys didn't all live in the same town or the same state or even, in some cases, the same country. And that is exactly where we are now. And I think, in those days, the modus operandi was the deals of you doing that piece, I do that piece, were done very, very quickly, extremely quickly. But these built into what you now see as huge corporations. We use them on our desks every day, or they're in our phones. I think that's exactly where we are now. And the key to actually getting that to that point is to know each other, to know what the strengths are, how you can help. It's not a competition, because I don't think anyone holds all the cards, even with respect, even in Boston and Cambridge. So I think we're in exactly the same cycle as the IT industry was quite some years ago.
I think that's a great analogy. we can engage the audience. Do we have any questions from the audience at all? Do you think we're moving in the right direction? I mean, this is an example of how different regions of our country, different parts of the world, can share information so that we can do what we do better. It's a good way to sum it up.
Absolutely.
What else do you have to add, Kyle? Anything?
Yeah, the other piece which you asked about earlier, which is, so the mission of the Turnpike is twofold. There's a mandate up front that says it's patient-driven, and that membership in the Turnpike only requires that your focus is on collaboration and cooperation. This isn't a competitive environment. Now, that's critical to understand, because I don't ever look at the challenges that I face as I've got to beat Kristen to the punch, or, I've got to get ahead of Gavin. So there's this like-minded philosophy, and Bob, you've shared it from the beginning. It's interesting that you can have this kind of success without putting the competitive gloves on first, right? So the mission is twofold, and we've talked about the first half of the mission, which is how it is that we better support innovation. The other half of the mission of the Turnpike is how is it that we are better advocates in the public policy realm on behalf of the industry. And we've struggled for a long time in this regard as well, because we're so fractured in terms of the realities on the ground, the elected officials we deal with, but also the messaging and how the messaging gets out. And so that second function of the Turnpike, by allowing us to be able to all hum the same tune, to be able to sing from the same hymnal in terms of coordinating our messages as we're in the state houses, as we're with the advocates, as we're out in the community, shouldn't be understated, because that becomes critical to the heightened awareness and our ability to be able to push these initiatives forward. And whether it's whether this goes to transparency issues, whether this goes to biosimilars, any of the issues that we're looking at now, these are all educational issues from where I sit. And the better that we're able to coordinate those educational efforts, the better we're all served.
Yeah, it's a great point. And people, elected officials, often will not be supportive of our industry because there's not a lot of jobs attached to it. In Massachusetts and California, it drives our economy, so politicians will tend to be more supportive of our issues. But when you remove, like you said, when you remove the economic development lens and you look at the amount where sick people live, there's the same amount of sick people everywhere, right? And so if you look at issues like funding for the NIH, and you look at things like a pathway to biosimilars and patent reform and a lot of these legislative issues that we face locally and nationally, it's important that we tell that story consistently, with a united front, and we tell it around the patients. And I really see this collaborative effort as an opportunity to share that story and the best practices with states that may not have the resources to hire 25 lobbyists. Right? We don't need to do that. Let's share the information, and we can all do better. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, and, to put one final touch on this notion about where economic development plays in and how that lens fits, the better we're able to cooperate, the better we're all served long-term in economic development efforts. So this isn't, it's which foot do you put forward first? And that motivation then, I think, steers your vision and the way it is that you approach how you undertake economic development. That makes sense?
I guess. I think we're just trying to do the right thing here. And
that's what we're saying.
Yeah, and if everybody does the right thing, good things will happen. So any questions? We're going to wrap up. I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank you for your camaraderie and your teamwork, and it's always great to visit Indiana. I love going to the Kentucky Derby every year, and I look forward to going to Scotland soon. So thank you very much. How about a big round of applause for our panelists? And I believe that is the end of our programming for the day in the Massachusetts Pavilion. I'd like to thank our amazing partners at the Life Science Center. How about a big round of applause? Thank you. How about our friends from Ash Stevens over there selling like crazy? How about a big round of applause for Travis McCready? This is his first Bio International Convention as the CEO of the Massachusetts Life Science Center. He's wearing sneakers because he had a terrible, terrible accident to his ankle, but we're happy that you're back on the mend and you're not on crutches anymore, Travis. It's been a great day. We want to thank all of our sponsors. If you look around to the different organizations that partner to make the Massachusetts Pavilion what it is, we couldn't do it without your support. Tonight's going to be a great evening. Everybody can take the evening off from curing diseases and have a good time, and then get back to it early tomorrow morning. And how about a big round of applause for all the staff, the people that work at the booth, Team MassBio, Team Life Sciences Center, Team Mihai, everybody we see. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great evening.